Did you know Australia houses one of the largest deserts in the world? And it's not just sand and heat, there's a transformation happening. The Great Victoria Desert, a vast expanse stretching over 350,000 square kilometers, is an intriguing part of Australia's terrain. Located in the southwestern part of the continent, this desert, despite its seemingly inhospitable conditions, harbors a unique, resilient ecosystem. From the hardy spinifex grasses to the burrowing animals that call this place home, it's a testament to the incredible adaptability of nature. But the desert landscape is changing. The creeping threat of desertification is altering Australia's natural environments, turning once vibrant ecosystems into barren lands. However, amidst this challenging scenario, a glimmer of hope is emerging. Regreening efforts are underway. So, how is this barren landscape turning green? Let's dive into Australia's regreening efforts. Australia, known for its vast deserts, is now making headlines for a different reason: the regreening of its arid lands. The transformation of Australia's dry landscapes into lush, green pastures is no small feat. It's a mammoth task that's been set in motion thanks to the concerted efforts of local communities, government bodies, and international organizations. Let's take a closer look at the heart of these regreening efforts. In the Australian outback, a project named Greening Australia is underway. This initiative is all about restoring and conserving Australia's unique landscapes by harnessing the power of nature. The project involves planting native species that are drought-resistant and capable of surviving the harsh outback conditions. The result? Vast areas of barren land are slowly but surely turning green. But it's not just about planting trees. It's about creating sustainable ecosystems. This is where permaculture comes in. Permaculture is an approach to land management that adopts arrangements observed in flourishing natural ecosystems. It's about working with, rather than against, nature. In the outback, permaculture projects are using this philosophy to transform arid lands into self-sustaining, productive landscapes. Let's not forget the crucial role of local communities. They're the custodians of the land, and their knowledge and understanding of the local environment are invaluable. In the regreening process, they're actively involved in planting, maintaining, and monitoring the growth of new vegetation. Government bodies and international organizations are also stepping up to the plate. They're providing much-needed funding, resources, and expertise to ensure these regreening efforts are successful. These collective efforts are gradually changing the face of Australia's deserts. What was once a barren, arid landscape is now showing signs of life and vibrancy. It's a testament to what can be achieved when we put our minds to it and work together for a common cause. These efforts have not only changed the landscape, but also brought hope for a greener future. But what does this mean for Australia's biodiversity? Scene script. Imagine a desert blooming with life. That's the new reality of Australia's regreened areas. As the vast Australian outback transforms, it's not just the landscape that changes. The benefits of regreening extend far and wide, and none more so than to the ecosystem. As the desolate desert turns into a green haven, the biodiversity of this region is experiencing a remarkable resurgence. Let's talk about the flora first. With the return of lush greenery, plant species that were previously scarce or even extinct in these regions are now thriving. From the hardy acacia to the iconic eucalyptus, the plant life is flourishing, creating a vibrant tapestry of green that breathes life back into the deserts. But it's not just the plants. The animal kingdom is also reaping the benefits of this green revolution. Native fauna such as the red kangaroo, the dingo, and the emu, which had been struggling due to the harsh desert conditions, are now witnessing a population boom as their habitats are restored. The return of these species is a testament to the resilience of nature, and proof that given the right conditions, life will always find a way. And let's not forget the local communities. For them, this transformation is more than just an environmental victory. It's a lifeline. The regreening efforts have revitalized farming, as the once barren lands are now fertile and capable of supporting crops. This, in turn, has boosted the local economy and improved the quality of life for these communities. Furthermore, the regreened areas are becoming hotspots for ecotourism, attracting visitors from all over the globe. This not only brings in additional revenue, but also helps raise awareness about the importance of environmental conservation. From a barren desert to a thriving green oasis, Australia's transformation is nothing short of a miracle. But can this miracle continue? We'll delve deeper into that in the next segment, so stay tuned. As we marvel at Australia's green transformation, we also wonder, what's next for this regreening revolution? The future holds promise, yet it is not without its challenges. Climate change continues to be a formidable adversary, threatening to undo the progress made. Resource constraints, too, pose a challenge, for the process of regreening requires both time and significant investment. But these hurdles are not insurmountable. They only highlight the need for continued efforts, for unwavering commitment to the cause of regreening, and this is a cause that transcends borders. It is a global endeavor. Collaboration and unity are vital, as nations share knowledge, resources, and technology to accelerate the process of regreening. We are all stakeholders in this green revolution, custodians of a shared home. While the journey to a greener world is long and arduous, the results are worth the effort. So what role can you play in this green revolution?